the paradoxical nature of anxiety is it's not the worries. The worries are the most obvious manifestation of anxiety,
Hmm.
but they're not the cause. And I think the biggest issue is that people believe that the worries are actually the fundamental root cause of anxiety, where they're a byproduct.
Welcome back to the You Can Too podcast. On today's show, we have Dr. Russell Kennedy on the show. He is a physician, a neuroscientist, certified yoga instructor, meditation teacher, doctor. He is everything in between, and I'm really, really grateful for your time, Russell. I'd love to start for your childhood. I want to know, you talk so much about anxiety, and I'm excited to demystify it for everyone, because your work is a much different perspective shift than I think a lot of people are seeing anxiety as. So what role did anxiety play in your childhood, and how has it really developed who you are?
I don't think I really knew I was anxious as a young child. I mean, I grew up with a dad who had schizophrenia.
Mhm.
So there was a lot of chaos in my life. Like he was never abusive or violent or anything like that, but he would lose touch with reality for sure, which was very disturbing for a child, especially for a child who had a good dad. Like he was playful, fun, intelligent, he had all the things that you and and he really wanted to teach me stuff. So that it was really disturbing for me as a child to have this figure who was very attuned to me and then all of a sudden just lose him
Yeah.
completely. So I think, Gordon Neufeld, my mentor in developmental psychology, has said that all anxiety is separation anxiety. And then I tag on to that, and it's mostly separation from yourself. But it starts typically with a separation from your parents, from your caregivers. So I had this separation from my dad where I kind of learned, hey, we're jumping right in here, where I kind of learned it wasn't safe to trust love, right? So I loved this figure. He was he was great to me. And then I would lose him every sort of 6 to 18 months to mental illness. So after a while, the child in me just thought, okay, well, I guess I can't really trust this guy because when I love him and I see him suffer so much in depression or mania or whatever, I had to kind of protect myself from that. So what I did was I protected myself from love. And when you block love for yourself, basically you're just setting yourself up for a life full of anxiety.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, and I'm realizing this more and more the more I step into your work, and so much about this idea of how it lives in our body.
Mm.
I feel like a lot of people are going through life, like you said, not knowing that they're anxious, like a low level
Yeah.
of ambient anxiety throughout their life. How can you tell if you are anxious, or if that's just if that's stress? Like, what do
It's
you feel is the
That's
difference?
a very good question, James. It's a very good question. I mean, I think there's anxiety in life in general,
Yeah.
right? I think that there's no, especially these days, especially with, getting through COVID and then maybe having COVID come up again. And there's anxiety. There's the Israeli situation now. There's, the Russia conflict. There's all sorts of anxiety in the world. I don't think you're ever going to escape anxiety because from an evolutionary perspective, we are trained as human beings in a way or programmed to be anxious because that kept us alive. You know, the most scared member of the tribe was the one that survived and the one that said, hey, let's go down that waterfall where all the lions are. Those people didn't survive, right? So it's just we are selected out to be kind of an afraid species. Now, if that starts taking over your life, like if most of your day is spent in apprehension, in alarm, in fear of
Mhm.
some thing that might happen, then you probably have an anxiety disorder. And there's probably something that we can look at. But it's not as well defined as, say, depression. You see someone with depression, they're low energy, they don't really want to do anything, they sleep a lot. Anxiety doesn't have that same kind of overt appearance to it. Like a lot of people with anxiety appear very normal. I was a physician, a practicing doctor with crippling anxiety. And you know, anxious people are very good at putting on the front that they're normal, but we're not.
Yes, very true, very true. I love. I'm so excited to dive into your work, because your work is, I think for so many people that do have anxiety, they're not aware of what the purpose of anxiety even is.
Yeah,
And your idea of anxiety is to point towards your younger self, right?
typically. Yeah.
W- w- Yeah, you
Yeah.
can
So, I
dive in.
mean, yeah, what I think anxiety is a separation of your mind from your body. So, what we do when we feel afraid or we feel anxious or we feel alarmed is we go up into our heads and we become hypervigilant and we ruminate, because as children, that was probably the only avenue that we had, because you're a powerless and helpless child. You know, if your father's an alcoholic, there's not much you can do about that as a 6-year-old. But when we get that feeling of helplessness and powerlessness, it does create certain brain patterns and brain sort of neurotransmitter patterns. You know, we lean heavily on kind of norepinephrine in the brain. So we lean heavily on this activating chemical to keep us safe, to keep us hypervigilant, because we assume that if we're worried and we're prepared, that that will help us for whatever trauma that we might come up. But, you know, being like I was, being prepared for 18 months for my father to go off the rails every day was exhausting on my mental and physical health. So it's I think it's learning as human beings. Yes, there's a time for anxiety. There's a time for looking at the possibilities of what might go wrong. But if you're fixated on them, that's when we really start getting into problems. So it's just understanding that this is a hyper reaction of something that's normal in us. It's normal to worry. It's normal to kind of anticipate things that aren't good for you. But if it overtakes your life, that's when it starts becoming a real problem, because it tends to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more you adopt a philosophy of worry, the more that philosophy of worry is going to fill you up. And the more you block love for yourself and others, the more you'll fill up with worry. And I think that's one of the reasons why how we heal from that is filling yourself up with love for yourself, which is not something that we got used to doing as children, because we get used to judging, abandoning, blaming, and shaming ourselves. Because if our family of origin isn't going well, kids blame themselves. There's a great saying that says, when you abuse, neglect, or abandon a child, the child doesn't stop loving the parent, they stop loving themselves. And that's the genesis, that's the start of the inner critic. And then the child looks for confirmation that they are somehow bad. So they judge themselves, they abandon themselves, they blame themselves, they shame themselves, which creates this tremendous amount of alarm in their system, which goes up into the head and drives the worry. And then the worry drives more alarm in the body, and the alarm in the body drives more worry. And we get into this alarm anxiety cycle. Man, we're really getting into this deep really quick.
That's what I like. I love diving into this stuff because I think it's so important. Your work is really really important, and I resonate. Honestly, when I came across your work to begin with, it was a slap in the face, recognizing, because I think for a lot of us, we try to solve problems through our mind when it's really in the body, and it lives in our body, and you know it starts so young. What does the role of a parent or your childhood play? Because my mom was an avid worrier. Like to this day, she worries as much as she can, and I tell her, don't suppress your worries on top of me because I don't need them. I'll give them back
Yeah.
to you. How does that play out?
Well, you'll pick them up anyway, James. Like
Yeah,
I tried my best to hide my worrisome nature from my daughter, Leandra. You
yeah,
know, we would do adventurous things. We would, but she could feel it. I mean, I think kids are very attuned to their parents. So I'll have people on a regular basis saying, "Hey, my 15-year-old son's anxious. My 17-year-old daughter's anxious. Can you work with her?" And it's like, well, I'll probably work with you first because she's probably picking up on your energy. And, to be fair, the parent is probably picking up on their parent's energy.
yep.
So your mother's energy or mother's father's energy was probably worried as well. So it just these things get handed down this family. That's why we have, well, as a family doctor, I would see anxious families or depressed families or families that had a lot of autoimmune disease. Like it just, we're just mosaics of our ancestors. So we develop these kind of patterns, and some of us are more anxious than others, for sure. Some of us are born more sensitive than others, and I think we do pick up on our parents' patterning. And if our parents aren't that aware that this is what they're doing, they just unconsciously pass it down to the child. It's not their fault because it got passed into them, but it becomes our responsibility, if you're an anxious person, to stop, to become a cycle breaker, to change that cycle for your family, for your kids, for the people that are going to come after you. You have a responsibility to say, I don't want to do this anymore. Like, I don't want to keep passing this down.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It's funny because as soon as I came across a bunch of podcasts that you were on, I recommended them to my mother because it was a lot of that kind of stuff that she needs to hear. That I think we all need to hear. Really, how can we get clear on what those patterns are? Because I do believe, like you said, a lot of people are unaware that those patterns are playing out to begin with. So whether it's the
Yeah.
pattern that's playing out, or what we're anxious of, or how it's playing out, like how do we gain clarity on how to really interrupt that pattern?
I think the single best thing is when you're feeling alarmed. I like the term alarmed rather than
Me too.
anxious because it's more has more consciousness to it. When you're feeling alarmed, look into your body rather than going into your head. Going into your head is an endless machination of just more and more worries. Like worries will just lead to more worries. It's just how it works. But if you can go into your body and see if you can really isolate where you feel this anxiety, this alarm in your body. Usually it's in the midline somewhere between your chin and your solar and your pubic bone. Just sort of search in there and see if there's a pressure or a pain or a heat or a discomfort that's there that's associated with what you're telling yourself, with your worries. And for me, it's in my solar plexus. It's hot. It's about the size of a fist. It pushes up into my heart, pushes into my spine. It feels like a pressure, like a pressury pain kind of thing. And that I actually believe is my younger self asking for my attention. So it's in your body. Like if we look at it, and if we want to go into the neuroscience of it, I actually believe that there's a place in our well, there is a place in our brain called the anterior insula, and the insula is deep in our brain, and it's kind of like the part of the brain that translates the sensations from the body and the thoughts of the mind. It's kind of like a way station between the two of them. And I do think that it creates this kind of emotional signature in our bodies, this part of our brain called the insula that's very involved in feeling and sensation. So, say for example, you got bit by your family cat when you were, 5 years old. There's going to be a part of you that's afraid of cats. So, but there's also going to be an emotional signature or sensation in your body
Mhm.
when you see a cat. Now, it's the same thing with anxiety. We have this emotional signature in our bodies, I believe, from the insula and the amygdala and other parts of our brain that makes us feel now exactly the same way we did when our mother was screaming at us when we were 5, or our father was drunk, or our dad was addicted or whatever. There's a feeling in there. And then when we have that feeling, we get the exact same corresponding thoughts now that we did back then. They may be a little more sophisticated because, as we get older, our thoughts get more sophisticated, but the nuts and bolts are the same. So we create this alarm in our body that becomes the real source of anxiety. And what I see a lot in North American society is we try and fix the mind with the mind, but what if the ultimate problem isn't in the mind? Now, people will say, well, I think something and then my body reacts. That's true. Absolutely. But what we're not aware of, because we worship the mind in the society, we don't pay a whole lot of attention in the body, is maybe that started in your body. And because you're so used to looking into your mind, you don't even consider. So it comes back to my original statement is look into your body when you're feeling anxious, because that will give you some kind of maybe not initial relief, but it will give you an idea that you're on the right track. And when we're on the right track, our brain secretes dopamine. It sort of tells us, this is where you should be going. So find this place in your body, put your hand over it, connect with it, because I do believe that alarm is a representation of your younger self. And if you can connect with and soothe that younger version of you, you're actually going at the root cause of what's causing your anxiety in the first place, rather than just scrambling to fix your thoughts, which does work to some extent, but it's a never-ending story. Like you'll never get off that treadmill. You have to go back and switch the treadmill off, which is basically, finding the alarm, treat the alarm, connect with the alarm. That switches the treadmill off. Otherwise, you're always going to be trying to worry your way out of think your way out of a feeling problem, which just doesn't work.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to fix the story when the story started from the feeling.
Mhm.
And when because
Totally.
we ascribe meaning to a feeling, and then that's why the story, and that it's a never ending cycle, like you said. For for practical purposes, what does that look like? Was it whether it's meditation? I know for me, going on walks without any headphones, no stimulation, and really helps
Mm.
me get an idea of how I'm feeling and check in within myself. What would you say for someone that doesn't know where to start to even get clear on where that is in their body?
First of all, just be aware when you're worrying,
Mm,
because there's a part of our brain called the prefrontal cortex, which is just, behind our forehead,
Yeah.
which has a lot of our executive functions. It sort of directs, it's kind of like the director of the brain.
Mhm.
Now, when we get into alarm, we paralyze that part of our brain. So we lose the ability at that point to start directing our attention, and our attention automatically defaults into the emotional pain, and then we just, we get swallowed by it. So trying to maintain that prefrontal cortex, we best do that by breathing, putting our hand on our chest, connecting with ourselves, grounding ourselves in our body. Because when we ground ourselves in our body, we move out of survival brain. And what happens in survival brain is it paralyzes that thinking brain. Because in survival brain, if you look at it evolutionarily, in survival, we don't need to be close and connected. We just need to get the hell away from whatever's going to try and kill us. So that's how we're wired. So it's taking this point like, okay, how do I maintain a sense of peace and calm through my breath? And the physiological sigh is a great way of doing that. Andrew Huberman talks a lot about that. Like 2 quick sniffs in through your nose, and then a long exhale through your mouth. And again. Now that will automatically start to relax your body. When your body relaxes, you bring back online your thinking brain. You come out of the emotional brain a little bit, you move into your thinking brain. When you're in your thinking brain, you can kind of go, oh, you know what? This is what Dr. Kennedy said. He said, okay, let's go into my body and see where this alarm is, and breathe into it, stay with it, and show it that you see it, hear it, love it, and protect it. Now, it's a bit deep, to go in that quickly, but that's basically what happens is we find the alarm in our system, which is the real true source of our anxiety. We soothe that younger version of us, because that's the part of us that really starts the anxiety in the first place. And now we're actually healing the anxiety at its root cause, rather than just trying to put a happy face on it. I'm a happy, like smiling. Smiling will make you feel better. There's no two ways about that. It reflects back into your brain. Yeah, smiling makes you feel better. Thinking positive, gratitude, all that stuff helps for sure. But it's not going to heal you, because you're not actually dealing with the root cause of the issue. So when you deal with the root cause of the issue, and you add gratitude, and you add things that are helping you as far as thought processes go. But that's second. Thoughts are second. Ground yourself in your body first. Get out of survival mode, get out of emotional brain, move yourself into your prefrontal cortex, and then make decisions as to what you're going to do at that point, which is basically stay in that part of your anxious physiology in your body and connect with it, because that's the root cause of the issue in the first place. Anything else other than connecting with that younger version of you is basically just a band-aid. You'll make yourself feel better by just doing breathing exercises and that kind of thing, but you're not actually healing the root cause of the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. I think for whether it's procrastination, anxiety, most things we usually solve the symptom, not the problem. And
Yeah.
so it stays around. Do you feel it's necessary to figure out what happened in our childhood that prompted that emotion? Or do you feel that, yeah, go ahead.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
No, I mean, I think it's more important to connect with the sensation in your
Okay.
body. So say you were physically abused by your dad when you were
Mhm.
younger. You don't have to go into that whole situation, but you can just tap into the part of you that felt scared and lonely and hurt in your body
Mhm.
when that was happening, and just connect with that younger version of you. So, and a lot of people will have trauma before the age of 7, before they're what we call pre-verbal trauma.
Mhm.
So they won't even know. If you're
Yeah.
abused as a toddler, say hit or whatever, you won't have a conscious memory of that anyway.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of, can you tap into that sensation of fear that shows up when you go into the grocery store? But it's not, it really doesn't have anything to do with the grocery store. It has the fact that, maybe when you were in the grocery store when you were 3 or 4 years old, you got yelled at or screamed at or lost.
Mhm.
So it brings back that same sort of somatic sensation of fear and pain and loneliness. And that's the root cause of, anxiety, depression, eating disorders, all this kind of stuff. So it's really about finding that root cause in your body and dealing with that. And then I have nothing against cognitive therapies. I think they're very, very helpful. I just think that they're helpful after you've found some grounding and fertile ground in the body, because then the cognitive structures have a place to root and stay. If you just teach someone how to rearrange their thoughts, when they get anxious, the part of them that would teach them how to rearrange their thoughts, their prefrontal cortex, is now impaired. So cognitive therapy will often leave you when you need it the most. So what I mean by that is you go into alarm, you're going into an anxious state, you shut off the part of you that would say, hey, this is what CBT taught me how to do, but you don't have access to it because the part of your brain that learned the CBT has now been shut off.
Yeah.
So human beings are very curious in that, when we get alarmed, when we go into survival brain, we make more threat. We start looking around our environment for more threat, which is also evolutionary. But not only do we make more threat, but we paralyze the part of us that would actually tell us the threats aren't real. So one, we make more threat, and two, we believe the threats, which of course creates this alarm anxiety cycle that we can't get out of because we're not rational. We may think we are, but we're not.
Yeah, which is it all really comes down to a story after the feeling, right? And I think that that
Mhm.
story, if we are able to interrupt that story, I think the feeling starts to dissipate as we focus on it a little bit more, right? But most of us are caught in that story, and that story is just a reoccurring cycle throughout every single day of our life. I think for a lot of people, there's an ambient anxiety that they're not even aware of,
Yeah.
right? So for someone that maybe can't find that root cause, they can't get clear on why they're feeling anxious. Maybe they just woke up feeling anxious. What's the first step there?
It's just breathing and then just sort of settling into, where do I feel this in my body? Yeah, I know I'm worried about my exam coming up. I know I'm worried about my driver's license, my driver's test, or whatever it is. But that's the story. Like, where is the feeling behind that that's driving it? And that's why most anxiety therapies fail, is they try and fix the thoughts rather than, oh, my driver's license will be fine. I've practiced a lot. I've gone through a fake test. I should be fine. That's all cognitive structures,
Hmm.
as opposed to putting your hand on that saying, I understand that you're worried about this. I understand this is normal to be concerned about your driver's exam. Absolutely it is. But you know what? We're going to breathe into this. We're going to do some physiological sighs. We're going to sit with this, and we're going to show this pain that we're actually okay. So, and I'm not saying that the mind, it doesn't create anxiety. It absolutely does. So if your partner, boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife phones you up and says, hey, I want to split up, that's going to fire you into anxiety. Absolutely. But it will often be aggravated by, say, your abandonment fears or your abandonment pain of the past. That will fire into it as well. So it's a combination of thoughts creating alarm and alarm creating worries and thoughts. But it's much more the alarm
Yeah.
creating the worries and thoughts than it is the thoughts creating the alarm. So that's why when we try and fix it just using thoughts, because thoughts aren't the real ultimate cause,
Hmm.
that's why it doesn't heal your anxiety. And that's why when we deal with it somatically, when we deal with it in the body, that's because that's the true root cause of where this alarm anxiety is stored. That's how you heal, instead of just cope. And you said something earlier that was really important. It's like, in this society, we deal with symptoms rather than the underlying cause,
Yeah.
which is basically my job as a doctor, was basically not to find why people had, an ulcer or irritable bowel disease or any of that stuff. It was basically, here's the symptom, here's the treatment. Now, the symptom that you're coming to see the doctor about is, it can be related to your underlying trauma. If I just keep throwing antibiotics at you or keep throwing anti-inflammatories at you, I'm actually dangling you over the gates of hell, because I'm never actually allowing you the opportunity to allow things to get bad enough that you're actually do something about the root cause, which is going back, finding that child, because we don't want to go back into our childhood pain, so we'd rather avoid it. by, taking medications. And I'm not against psych medications at all, but taking medications, doing things that kind of bypass the pain. But as you bypass the pain, you never actually deal with the root cause of it. And if you've got a fire burning there and you just ignore the fire is just going to get stronger and stronger and stronger. So it's really understanding the true root cause of what we call anxiety is more of an alarm state in the body than it is a thinking state of the mind. And we are fooled into believing that it's a thinking state of the mind. And that's how it's fixed, is why anxiety treatments are so pitiful in traditional medicine, psychiatry, psychology, because a year later, almost everybody's back to the same level of anxiety that they were before they did the cognitive psychotherapy work. You need to do somatic work as well. I'm not against cognitive work. I think it's very helpful, but as an initial stage, it's not the best bang for the buck. The best bang for the buck is go in, do some somatic work, ground yourself in your body, and then go into your traumas, then tease it out with a therapist. But if you just go in there and you just deal with the issue itself that you believe is the problem in your thinking mind, you're never actually going to get to the root cause of it. And you're going to be paying your psychologist, $150 an hour for every week for 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, I was just speaking with a somatic practitioner yesterday, and it seems as though we almost lean on talk therapy because we don't want to do the actual deep work
Totally.
that somatic is providing, right? And it's a tough thing, but I think it goes back to the knowing that most people aren't aware of the subconscious patterns that are playing out. And so if we're not aware that it's happening, we can't even think to interrupt it. But
Yeah.
self-awareness just simply isn't enough, right? Like that, we have to go deeper into that. And I know that you left medicine in 2013. You went full time into everything that you're doing now, and
Right.
you went to India.
Well,
And
I caved for 3.5 years. I got up at 2 every day. I barely functioned. I barely ate. I lost 30 pounds. So it wasn't like, hey, I'm getting out of medicine, I'm going to start this new field. I
yeah,
caved for about 3 years, and that's when I did psychedelics, and
yeah.
my world kind of fell apart then. But then I started, 7 years ago, starting to put it back together. So
Yeah. When you started doing psychedelics and you went to live in India, what was that experience like? What did it teach you about yourself and the
it was
practice you do?
lonely. It was really lonely, I think. I think I've been lonely most of my life, because my dad wasn't really there. I mean, he was there for me, but I didn't trust him being there. My mom had to work a lot. She was a registered nurse, so to support the family. So I think there was a real sense of loneliness with me. And when I went to India and stayed at a temple there, it was like I had to deal with my loneliness. I
Yeah.
really had to kind of come full circle with it. And I'd like to say that I healed it, but I didn't. It felt better when I finished, when I came back from India, but I was a long way from healed. So in India was 2013, and then ayahuasca was 2014. Psilocybin, I think, was 2014 as well.
Mm.
And those are the things that actually really switched things around for me, because LSD actually showed me that
Yeah.
my anxiety was in my body and not my mind. So I was a victim of the same thinking that, oh, I just got to change my thoughts. I have to get, more therapy. I've got to do different things. But really LSD said, hey, you know what? Your anxiety is actually stuck in your mind, in your body, in your solar plexus. And it didn't really tell me how to fix it, but it just sort of said, hey, you're chasing your tail going up into your head because it's not there. The little saying I said is, don't look for the peanut butter in the tree because it's not going to be there. Right. Like it's a matter of just sort of finding the original thing. So when I came back from India, just felt like empty, like hollow, like balsa wood. There was no fluid in my tissues. I mean, there was, but it just felt like I was just dry and just burned out, and like nothing was going to get better. Nothing was going to get better. This was going to be the rest of my life. And I wasn't going to, I probably was going to wind up taking my own life like my dad did, because life was just completely empty at that point. So then I started going into, okay, well, if this is in my body, how can I kind of look at that? Can I connect with this in my body? And then slowly over the course of, 2 or 3 years, I thought, oh, this actually makes a difference. This actually really works.
Yeah.
For the first time, I have something that actually works in the long term, as opposed to just taking medication or, changing my thoughts. Here was something that actually worked. And so I really dove into that. And that was the genesis of the book that I started writing in 2019, I believe, 2018.
Mm-hmm.
And my programs, my mind body programs, all that kind of stuff. It really comes from my own healing, like how I healed from chronic and crippling anxiety. And it wasn't from traditional methods, and just sharing it with other people. So that's why I wrote the book. That's why I'm framing up a second book now, and trying to really help people understand that traditional therapy is probably not going to help them, which is going to piss off a fair amount of, traditional therapists, but it's true. But they have to start understanding that you can't just talk your way out of this feeling. You have to start introducing some sort of somatic concepts as well. And that's kind of like my life's work, is to bring out somatic therapy as well as cognitive therapy and blend them together. It's not that I don't think cognitive therapy is helpful, but I think that we need that grounding in our body first for the cognitive therapy to stick. My wife's a somatic trauma therapist, and she said to me, somatic therapy takes a long time, because we're just sort of slowly and incrementally getting used to being safe in your body, which takes a while for people that have had trauma. And cognitive therapy works right away. It starts reframing your thoughts right away. But cognitive therapy doesn't stick. And somatic therapy sticks, but it takes a long time.
Yeah.
So it's this, and in our society, we want the quick fix. So we go more for the cognitive therapy because it gives us the illusion of working, but it doesn't really help us in the long term. So that's kind of like my mission, is to introduce a combination of both, so that we can give people a chance to not have to suffer with anxiety to the depth that I did.
Which is amazing work, and you're obviously helping a
Thanks,
lot of
James.
you're obviously helping a whole lot of people. And looking forward to having you on when the second book comes out as well, because I love talking about this kind of stuff.
Sure.
That's so the first, like, I guess, myth we can see is that you solve it through your mind, which is obviously not the reality of it. And the more that I talked with some people that are in any kind of somatic work,
Mm,
it just reinforces why I want to do it so much. And it's just stuff that excites me, because it's the terrifying stuff that we really don't want to face. What are
yeah.
some of the other myths that you've seen around anxiety, even maybe that you believed prior, that now you've broken through?
I mean, I think the big one is you can fix thinking with more thinking. I mean, if anxiety is a problem of excess thinking, you're not going to solve it with adding more thinking in it,
Yeah.
right? But that's the ridiculousness of the mind. The mind will always kind of try and say, "Hey, wait, we have the answer over here with more thinking. Like, come on," and then we believe it. If our prefrontal cortex is paralyzed, and we're kind of in this vulnerable state, we'll believe anything that may help us heal. So, and again, it's not that I don't think CBT and ACT and cognitive therapies are helpful. It's just that they don't tend to stick. And you also need your prefrontal cortex to engage those cognitive therapies. So if the anxiety itself paralyzes your prefrontal cortex, you're not having access to all this work that you've done, this cognitive work that you've done. So that's why I said you have to ground yourself in your body first. And then when your prefrontal cortex comes back online, when it feels safe to come back online, and you move out of the emotional brain and into the thinking brain, then your thinking brain can direct you into something that's helpful, as opposed to just automatically sort of, defaulting into worry after worry after worry. Because worry does provide a service for people. I mean, one of the things that people with anxiety hate the most is uncertainty, right? So one of the things that worry does is it gives uncertainty a little more certainty.
Mhm.
So if you have a headache and you think, oh my God, I have a brain tumor, for about 0.4 of a second, your brain secretes dopamine and says, hey, you might be right. You're on the right track. And then, a second later, like, well, I got a freaking brain tumor now. And then the whole worry cycle starts again. So worry is very addictive, because in my opinion, what worry does is it takes that uncertainty that we hate, specifically as anxious children and anxious adults, and it makes it a little more certain. Now, the bargain is that, it makes it more certain, but it also makes it more scary.
Yeah.
So you're caught in, so now you have to worry more to kind of catch up with the original sort of 0.4 shot of dopamine in there that you got from the original worry in the first place. So the worries have to get more complicated, and they have to get more deep, and they have to get more scary to have the same kind of ironic relief potential. So that's why I think we get stuck into worry and just realizing that worry just is a trap, So what I tell people is it's a much better use of your time and energy to just sit in that feeling of discomfort in the alarm in your body than it is to go into your head. Now, both are painful, at least initially. So it's not like, I'm just going to go in my body and it's going to feel better. Now, for some people, it does. Some people know that they're on the right track immediately when they go into their body. But sometimes, when you go into your body feels bad. I mean, that's where the alarm sits, right? So you don't want to go there. So you're in no man's land. I'm in my body and it hurts. Now I know if I go up into my head, I'll get this 0.4 second of relief. So it's so seductive.
Yeah.
We're almost operantly conditioned, like Pavlov's dogs, to go into worry because as a child, that worry gave you some sense of control, right? But you're not a child anymore. You can actually heal from this rather than just dealing with it. So I think that's the main thing. Again, it's just learning how to feel this in your body and allow it to be there. There's a great book called The Body Keeps the Score. I don't know if you've read it, but it's a great book. And in that, Bessel van der Kolk talks about we're not teaching people how to get rid of their anxiety. What we're teaching you how to do is acclimatize to that. I call it alarm. He doesn't call it that, but acclimatize to that feeling of alarm in your system so it doesn't automatically fire you up into your head into worry all the time, where you can actually sit with the root cause of it and metabolize it rather than immediately going into your head. Because if the problem is here, if this is where your alarm is sitting, and when you get afraid, your partner calls you up and says, hey, we got to talk about our relationship, or there's a tax bill, or there's a test or whatever. When you get stressed and this lights up, going up into here isn't going to do anything. Here's the problem. This is what you have to do. This is what you have to sit with. This is what you have to metabolize. This is what you have to stay with. It's very hard to do, at least initially. But once you learn how to do it, you're actually on the road to healing as opposed to just coping.
Yeah, which is such a massive distinction.
It
Such
is.
a massive distinction, because it's almost it is ironic how we worry because we give ourselves a false sense of security over if I worry about this thing, then I have control over it. If
Right.
I worry about it as much as I can, then I know that I can have some sort of control over the outcome, which is just
Yep.
it's not how it works whatsoever, as we've spoken about. And let's say we're in a consistent thought loop and we can't get into our body for some reason. We just can't get clear on where it's at. What do you say to someone that wants to really just get better at lowering that anxiety?
Yeah. Cold plunges.
Yes.
Cold plunges are really helpful. Here's the thing about cold plunges, and I know it's not for everybody, but what happens is when you were a child, you were often put in a situation that you had no control over, and it was very painful. There is something about putting yourself into a painful situation that you do to yourself, right? So if you decide I'm going to go into this cold water and it's going to hurt, but I'm going to do it because it's my choice,
Yeah.
that teaches you that you're not this powerless, helpless victim that you were when you were 6 years old, right? So I think that's one of the reasons why cold plunges are so helpful. If you look at the neuroanatomy of the way that the spinal column and the way that the brain works, the dorsal horn, the back part of the spinal cord, transmits pain and temperature. And emotional pain and physical pain have a big overlap in the brain. So if you're using a pathway that transmits pain and temperature, when you override that with a tremendous amount of temperature, like as you do in cold, I believe that it actually gives you some resilience to handle pain as well, emotional and physical. So it kind of teaches you, hey, I can put myself into this painful situation. And not only that, I can handle this painful situation. Because one of the things that anxiety does is it tells us you can't handle this. You're a victim. You have to go into worry. You have to go into fight or flight. And when you do it for yourself, when you put yourself in uncomfortable situations, you teach yourself, you know what? I can actually, this is uncomfortable. I don't like it, but I can actually stay with it. And I think there's something about cold plunges that are very, very helpful for people with anxiety, because it teaches us, one of the things about anxiety is that it teaches us to overestimate threat and underestimate our ability to deal with it. And the two of those things, just create a tremendous amount of alarm. So if you learn that you can handle threat and that you can actually deal with it, you're really going at the root fundamental cause of what's creating your victim mentality and creating your anxiety in the first place.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying that everybody with anxiety has to do cold plunges, but I think it's actually really beneficial, because I do think that we get into this place with anxiety is that we narrow our lives. It's like, I don't want to do that because that makes me too scared, right? And when we do that, our lives get narrower and narrower and narrower. And your brain will secrete chemicals that will support whatever you decide to do. So if you decide, this is the common example that I use. If you see someone cross at a party that you'd like to talk to, you're attracted to for whatever reason, and you go, okay, I'm going to just do it, bite the bullet, go over, lean on my balls of my feet and go for it. Now, as you're walking over there, your brain, through the periaqueductal gray, the bottom part of your brain, will start secreting your own natural morphine, your brain's morphine, that'll kind of help you with the pain of this. It will also secrete dopamine because you're on the right track. Like, you are going towards something that you want. So those two things reinforce you moving forward, and they also drop a lot of your fear. Now, if you sit in that chair and you look at this person, you go, no, they're too good for me. They're not going to like me. They're going to reject me. I remember 2 weeks ago when I asked that person out and they rejected me. It's going to be the same thing. Now what you've done is your brain secreting all sorts of norepinephrine, noradrenaline, and your body secretes all this cortisol because it's the stress hormone. And then that's going to make you think, okay, yeah, no, I can't do this. I'm in danger. Like, there's no way. So whichever way that you kind of decide to go, and this is similar to the cold plunges, as you decide to go into the cold plunge, your brain will support you. It will create all sorts of morphine and dopamine that says, hey, good for you doing this. But if you chicken out, and there's nothing really wrong with chickening out, but you need to know when you can do it. But when you move back away from whatever scares you, the chemicals will rise up to confirm, yeah, that was too scary. We're not going to do that ever again. And then your life gets narrower and narrower and narrower.
Yeah, it seems like the promises that we keep to ourselves have a much bigger impact on our lives than we think.
Mm.
Like something as simple as that, as getting into a cold plunge, saying you're going to do it and then doing it, and then you reinforce the idea of yourself that is a person that does what they say they'll do.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
that's built up throughout our entire lives, of this story, of this idea of who we think we are. And if we grow up thinking we're an anxious person, it's going to cause us to be more anxious. So
Totally.
not only building that relationship with our childhood self, but even our self that we envision ourselves as now, how can we build a better relationship with the idea of who we are, than to create a better version of ourselves to make it less of a habit?
Yeah, it's a great question. So what happens when we're children and we're traumatized is we develop this sense that it's our fault.
Mhm.
So we start this thing where I call jabs. We judge, abandon, blame, and shame ourselves as children.
Yeah.
And then we look for things in our environment that confirm what we already believe.
Mhm.
So if you believe that you're a shy person, anything that makes you think you're a shy person will rise into your awareness, and you will give a lot of credibility for. Any brave thing you do, you'll just ignore because it doesn't fit that confirmation bias.
Yeah.
So we judge, abandon, blame, and shame ourselves as children, and that pattern continues to kind of take our life apart as we get older. So just seeing, often it's like journaling, like, where do I judge myself? Like, write down all the things that you think are inadequate about you. Where do I abandon myself? Well, the other day when I got invited with two of my friends, I didn't feel like, I didn't like one of them, so I decided not to go, rather than just, I'm going to go, I'm going to see if I can resolve this. Where do you abandon yourself? Where do you blame yourself? Oh, I shouldn't have done that. That was terrible. Where do you shame yourself? Oh, I'm bullied. I'm a horrible person, whatever. And just really become aware of those jabs that you take at yourself and write them down, and then sort of see. And then almost in a Byron Katie fashion. I don't know if you know Byron Katie, but she's big about questioning, like, is it true?
Mm-hmm.
And just sort of say, is it true that I'm, not attractive? Is it true that I am weak? Is it true? And then just, is that true? And just going through those items, going through those places where you judge, abandon, blame, and shame yourself, and you sort of say, how is the opposite of what I'm saying to myself actually more true? And then when you see that, it's like, oh, I'm actually a brave person. Yeah, well, you did chicken out of that, asking that person out. But, 2 days ago, you went up to somebody at the grocery store and, helped them with their groceries, or did something that was brave. But again, if it doesn't fit our image of ourselves, it just fades.
Yeah.
But if it does fit our image of ourselves, and the brain has a negativity bias, so we are trained as human beings to look at ourselves negatively, and then we will look for confirmation of what a bad person we are, or if we're ugly or short or whatever. We'll just look for that confirmation rather than taking the opposite view of, how is the opposite of what I'm telling myself actually more true than what I have just naturally defaulted into. So that is a really helpful way, I think, of starting to deaminate and break down that inner critic, because it's the inner critic that feeds the alarm, and it doesn't allow the alarm to heal. So the combination of breaking down those jabs that you take at yourself, and then having this compassionate connection with where you feel the alarm in your system, the two of those things actually really act in synergy to help you heal from anxiety rather than just cope with it.
Yeah. The the realization for me, I had Derek Sivers on a few months ago, and he brought up the idea of that he takes things as, is it useful for me, rather than, it doesn't have to be true. Like, let's say, like,
Okay.
if you want to be a confident person and it's maybe you don't see it as true, is it useful for me? If it's a useful belief, I'm going to take it on because it's
Mm,
useful for me. And so it's kind of like what you said, is being able to reframe it through a different lens by asking a different question. And it really is really, really important to take a different lens on that. Because you've broken down anxiety in such a way that I think a lot of people want to go against, because they want the instant
sure.
hit. Is there any sections or parts of anxiety that you feel is glossed over a little bit too much that you want to press upon?
I think it's really just understanding that it's not the worries. That's the obvious, like the paradoxical nature of anxiety is it's not the worries. The worries are the most obvious manifestation of anxiety,
Hmm.
but they're not the cause. And I think the biggest issue is that people believe that the worries are actually the fundamental root cause of anxiety, where they're a byproduct. They're just an effect. And the worries are not you specifically. The worries are your ego trying to protect you. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like your ego is there to try and help you. The ego isn't bad. It's just trying to protect you. If as a child you got ridiculed all the time, your ego will say, "Hey, let's just not go out. Let's not be around people." Now, it's not trying to hurt you. It does hurt you because you're not connecting with other people,
Yeah.
but it's trying to protect you. And that's the thing about our natural ego response is it usually pulls us away from the very place that we have to go to. Now, I'm not saying that everybody has to charge their fears all the time, but just challenging your fears and just going against them consciously, so that you have engaged your prefrontal cortex. You say, hey, I am going to go over and talk to that person regardless of what happens. That you start interfering with the underlying programming. So if there is anything that gets really glossed over, it's the fact, and this is such a huge point, is that anxiety is really not the worries of your mind. It's the alarm state in your body. And if you deal with the alarm state in your body, you're actually going after the root cause of what you call anxiety, which is really a state of alarm. I mean, if I had my way, I would change the term anxiety to alarm, because
Yeah.
that's what it is. If you're talking to someone, you say, I have anxiety, and they don't have anxiety, they won't have a clue of what you're talking about. But if you say, hey, I really suffer from a lot of alarm in my life, everybody's been alarmed. Everybody knows they've been dealing with their mom's cancer diagnosis, or money issues or whatever. Everybody's been alarmed. So you can relate to that, because a lot of people don't know what anxiety is. As we started out this conversation today, it's not that well defined, so it's basically a state of hypervigilance and activation in the body. That's what anxiety is. It's really a state of alarm in our body that's only reflected by the mind. So the biggest thing that gets glossed over is we have to deal with the body, because that's where the root cause of the anxiety is. And that's why people have been in, talk therapy for 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years,
Dealing with the same
and they're
problems.
not a whole lot better.
Yeah. It's like life's going to keep teaching you the same lesson until it's learned. And
Totally.
it's going to keep teaching you until you lean into something different. And
Yeah,
I spoke with Britt Frank on this topic too. She sees it as an alarm as well, and I'm starting to take on that mindset as well, because it serves me, and I think it serves a lot of people if we take it on through a different lens. I think, as you spoke on earlier, the jabs that we take, I want to dive into that, because I think
sure.
shame is something I think a lot of people, whether it's
Totally.
consciously, subconsciously, they do in a way that, like, for example, people use the word should to such an extreme extent that I've replaced it as shame. I'm like, if you say should, you're shaming yourself, because it's usually not serving you. Um, how do we, I guess I don't like to use the word balance, because it's usually not, it doesn't work well, but
Yeah,
find the harmony between trying to better ourselves and become a better version, like with this idea that we should be further along, and then
right.
also allow ourselves to be in our body and allow ourselves to actually feel that emotion.
Yeah, I think it's just making the conscious intention, James. I think that's so much of what we do is unconscious,
Yeah.
and we don't think about it. It's just automatic. And just making the conscious intention, I'm going to be aware of how I shame myself, this week or today, or for the next hour.
Hmm.
How does that come out? Like, where do I shame myself? And there's a difference kind of between guilt and shame. Guilt is I did something
Right.
bad. Shame is I am bad. But guilt is something like I did something bad, but I can try and fix it.
Hmm.
Shame is I don't want to have anything to do with this. I just want to bury this as deeply as I can. So that's why shame becomes so difficult to kind of bring up. It's the old, Carl Jung saying,
Yeah.
until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you'll call it fate. So shame is one of those things that, it's a master puppeteer. Like it makes you do things that you don't want to, and it makes you avoid things that you should do, because you're afraid of this. Because shame ultimately means ostracization from your community, from your tribe.
Mhm.
That's what shame originally was designed for. There's this thing called healthy shame and unhealthy shame, and I know I'm not all that versed on how to parse it out,
Yeah.
but I think it's just shame is there for you to really acknowledge it. And, the truth shall set you free, like it is one of those things that when you acknowledge the shame that's there, you give it a chance to kind of come up a little bit,
Mhm.
and just incrementally kind of like, hey, can we deal with this a little bit? Can we kind of bring this up? Emotional, physical, sexual abuse of a child, tremendous amounts of shame that gets stuffed down, that hide, that create alarm, that create a tremendous amount of anxiety, depression, OCD, eating disorders, personality disorders. All this stuff forms from this repressed shame, or this repressed energy, typically of jabs of self-reproach somehow, and that alarm gets stored in our body, probably through the insula, probably through the amygdala, probably through different parts of the basal ganglia. This stuff gets actually stored in our system, but it's like we're not going to deal with it. So it's like bringing light to the darkness. And Carl Jung talks about that too, shadow work. It's
Yeah.
shame is really shadow work, and it's like, can you bring that shame into the light? And one of the things that I talk about with men is just allowing tears, because tears are one of those things that actually changes the brain. So your dog's still dead, your relationship is still over. Nothing externally has changed, but internally, there's something about the process of crying that changes your neural chemistry and changes your attitude towards the situation. It helps you cope and deal with it. Now, one of the reasons why I think men kill themselves is because they're not allowed to have tears anymore. We've taken this natural adaptation away from them. And I'm not saying you have to cry in front of your girlfriend or your partner or whatever, But you can go out in the car and go to the park, like I say, like go to the park and just start yelling and screaming and getting your frustration out, and often that will lead you into a place of tears, because men are really, really good at stuffing. And that's why I think we die of heart disease, and that's why I think we die of suicide, because we don't have this ability to metabolize, to be completely blunt, shame, like the shame of being male, which there is a lot of. So we need to get it out there that there are ways to metabolize this shame, but you can't metabolize it if you don't acknowledge it, if you're not willing to make the conscious intention to bring that shame to the surface, even though it hurts.
It's very powerful. It's very powerful. The catalyst to change is confrontation, our ability to be able to do that, right? And if we don't face that kind of
Yeah,
stuff,
I mean, I would, sorry to interrupt you,
I
James,
think you're
but
good.
I think it's more about flowing with it.
Mm.
It's not about I have to challenge this shame. I have to, I have to bring this out, and
Yeah.
it's more like, hey, you know what? You were sexually abused when you were 9 years old, and that is in you, and there's a lot of shame around that. It's not your fault. Can we flow with that together, like adult me and child me? Can we flow with that together and see what comes of it, rather than saying, I'm going to grab you by the collar and pull you up?
Yeah.
So it's more about, like, shame and flow typically don't go together. And I think if they did, we'd be a lot better off, because it's not confronting things 90 degrees, like this, it's black or white. It's kind of like, can we just sort of flow into it, and then maybe flow out of it again, and then flow into it again, and just sort of dip our toe in the shame and allow our body to acclimatize to the fact that we are going to deal with this really powerful energy that's in us, but we have to do it slowly.
Mm. When I thought of confrontation, I brought up Connor Beaton that I had him on
Yep.
my podcast, and that's
Yep.
a quote from his book that I really resonated with. But I think
Yeah.
I'm in alignment with you on that. I think if we build a better relationship with it, not so much face it in such a tough way that we end up ruining it, and we not able to build a better relationship long term. I think the purpose of your work is sustainability, so we don't have to go back to it and make it a part of it,
Yeah.
which is so powerful. There's one last question I ask every guest.
Sure. Sure.
I think that for a lot of this work is we need to unlearn what we took on from childhood, and so the purpose of all of this is to do that. My question to you is, what belief are you currently unlearning?
It's an interesting question, because at this point, because I never grew up with very much money.
Mhm.
My father smoked, so a lot of the money that my mother would make would go into my kind of father's addictions and that kind of thing too. So now, with the book being so successful, and the program being so successful, like, even as a doctor, it's not like I'm making millions of dollars a year, but I'm making more money than I ever have in my life. And there's a discomfort with that,
Mhm.
because there was a security in struggling financially. There was let's say, there was a familiarity
Yeah.
with struggling financially. It was a ceiling that I would go up against, and it's like, okay, I know the ceiling's there. It's kind of a boundary in a way. And now I don't have that ceiling. I have this kind of, I can pretty much buy what I want. I can't go down the street and buy a beachfront house, but I can pretty much buy what I want.
Yeah.
And it's disturbing. So the belief that I'm trying to get a hold of is that I don't have to struggle with money. So it's funny, when you conquer one of your demons and it's not there anymore, how you miss it.
Mhm.
How it, because it did form this, it gave me a sense of money that I could appreciate. And it's not that I don't appreciate money now. It's just that when you could just buy whatever you want within reason,
Yeah.
there is this kind of sense that, oh, I've never lived like this before. I've always worried about, oh, can I go on that vacation? Can I buy that sports equipment? Can I do that? So that's the belief that I'm working on now, that money will flow from this point on freely and openly. And how can I use that money to share more of what I'm good at with the world? But it's odd. It's odd when you conquer something that has been kind of kept you boundaried for so long. So that's the belief that I'm worried that I'm dealing with now, is like, can I just be free with money? Can I just not that I'm going to spend it everywhere, but just have a sense that I don't have to worry about money anymore. And it's odd.
Yeah.
It's odd.
It's like an attachment.
So
It's an attachment to
yeah,
it.
it is an attachment. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really powerful, and that's why I asked that question because we're as much work as you've done, we're all still unlearning something, and I think the reality of that is something that we need to touch on more. So I'm really grateful for your time and your presence and everything that you do in this world. So thank you so much, and all of your links will of course be in your show notes.
Yeah, thanks, James. It was really nice talking to a young man who really gets it. So thanks, and I'm happy to talk to you anytime.
Absolutely, thank you.